Every single night, a little girl drew a picture of her family, Mama on the left, herself in the middle, and a daddy she had never once met, standing far off at the edge of the page. She was 4 years old, and she already knew something was missing. Her mother knew it too, but neither of them had any idea that one ordinary job, one painting on one mansion wall, was about to change everything. Welcome to a channel built around the stories that matter most. Mafia bosses brought to their knees by love, broken families stitched back together, and the quiet courage of ordinary people in extraordinary moments. The lesson here is simple and shattering. A child does not need a perfect father. She just needs one who shows up and stays. If this story moved you, hit like, share it with someone raising a child alone, and subscribe, because our best stories are the ones still coming.
The woman stopped talking, and her face instantly turned pale. Her sharp eyes, the eyes of someone who once commanded an underground empire, locked onto Lena. She looked at her as if Lena were a stranger who had just lit a match next to a keg of dynamite. The silence that followed felt like it lasted 100 years, and it would change all of their lives for good. Catherine Kensington did not scream. She had no need to. Her voice became quiet, slow, and deliberate. Each word was like a cold stone dropping onto the marble floor. "What did you just say?" Her eyes narrowed, as sharp as a doctor's knife, as she looked Lena up and down, from her cheap shoes to her pale face. There was no shock in her expression. There was only the cold, hard thinking of a woman who had stood by the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast for 40 years. She was a woman who was used to dealing with all kinds of dangers. "I will ask you again," Catherine said, taking a single step toward Lena. The scent of her expensive perfume drifted through the air, but her eyes were anything but soft. "What did you say about my son?" Lena swallowed hard. Her throat felt as dry and rough as sandpaper. She knew she had just opened a door that could never be closed again. The words she had just said were still hanging in the air, heavy and impossible to pull back. "Ma'am, I know this sounds very—" Lena started, her voice trembling, but she forced herself to keep it level. "Sounds very what? Crazy? Shameless?" Catherine interrupted her. And now her voice held something far more dangerous than just anger. It held a tightly controlled scorn. "You have been in my house for less than 1 hour, and you have the nerve to stand before me and claim that my son, Jude Kensington, is the father of your child." She moved even closer. Lena wanted to back away, but her legs refused to obey. "People who try to swindle my family tend to meet unhappy ends," Catherine said, her voice as soft as velvet. But every single word carried the force of a judge's sentence. "I have seen all sorts of people show up at this door with every tragic story imaginable, hoping to get a few dollars from the Kensington family name. If you are playing a game, I suggest you stop it right now, while I am still willing to use my words." Lena felt the very real danger in that statement. This was not the kind of warning a rich woman gives to a disrespectful servant. This was the threat of someone who was used to giving commands, used to having them followed, and used to seeing people who defied her vanish from the board completely. But Lena had survived 27 years in a world with no safety net. She had slept in an abandoned car at 16. She had given birth all alone in a county hospital with no one there to hold her hand. She was well acquainted with fear, and she knew the biggest threat was not the powerful woman in front of her. The biggest threat was the truth that was burning inside her, fighting to be set free. "I am not trying to blackmail you," Lena said. Her voice was unsteady, but her gaze was locked on Catherine's. "I did not know who you were before this morning. I did not know who owned this house. All I know is that the man in that painting is the man I was in love with for 3 months, 5 years ago. He told me his name was Jack. He would come to the cafe where I worked every single morning and order a black coffee with no sugar. He would laugh when he told silly jokes. He would run his hand through his hair when he felt awkward, and he kissed my forehead every morning before he walked out the door." Lena's voice cracked on the last few words, but she fought back the tears, refusing to cry in front of this woman. Then one day, he was just gone. No explanation, no final word. The phone number he gave me was disconnected, as if he had been a ghost all along. She took a long, deep breath. 6 weeks later, I discovered that I was pregnant. I searched for him everywhere, but all I had was a fake name and the memory of a man who I now understand was never the person he pretended to be. Catherine stood perfectly still. Her expression did not change in the slightest. But Lena saw a small change in her eyes. It was not trust, not yet, but it was focus. It was the kind of focus a person gives when they are truly listening, not just waiting for their turn to talk. My daughter's name is Phoebe, Lena continued, her voice growing stronger, as if saying her child's name was an anchor in the middle of a hurricane. She is 4 years and 3 months old. I have raised her by myself since the day she was born. No one helped me, no family, no friends, just me and my baby girl. I did not come to this house to find my daughter's father. I came here because the salary is 3 times what I made at the cafe, and because my daughter deserves to have a full meal every single day. Lena paused to catch her breath. Seeing him in that painting was an accident. It was an accident I truly wish had never happened. The room fell, completely quiet. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows and spilled onto the Persian carpet, casting long stripes of light across the oak floor. The large clock on the wall ticked on, the only sound breaking the heavy silence between the two women. Catherine studied Lena for a long moment. It was no longer a look of judgment, but the look of someone putting together the pieces of a puzzle in her head. She was comparing what she had just heard with what she already knew, searching for a single hole in the story, and failing to find one. Then she turned, walked over to the deep blue velvet couch, and sat down. Her back was still perfectly straight, but her shoulders relaxed just a tiny bit. It was only a fraction of movement, yet it was enough for Lena to see that a crack had just appeared in her solid armor. "Sit down," Catherine said. Her voice was still cold, but it was no longer as sharp as a knife. It had changed into something else. It sounded like the voice of a professional detective when she starts to believe that the person she is questioning might actually be telling the truth. "Start at the very beginning. Tell me every single detail. Do not leave anything out." Lena told her the entire story, every last detail. She described Rosie's cafe in the South End, on the corner near the train station, where the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the steam rising off the sidewalks each morning. Jack, or as she now knew him, Jude, would always show up at 7:30 in the morning. He was never early and never late, as if he had a perfect internal clock. He always chose the same spot, the little table right by the window. He always ordered the exact same thing, a black coffee with no sugar. And he always looked at her with those gray-blue eyes when she carried the cup to his table. It was a look that made her hands shake so badly during that first week that she nearly spilled the coffee all over the table. Catherine listened to every word without saying anything. She sat as still as a statue on the blue velvet couch. Only her eyes moved, scanning every single expression that crossed Lena's face, searching for the tiniest hint that she was lying. When Lena finally finished her story, the room was silent once again. Catherine stood up, walked to an oak cabinet by the window, opened the second drawer, and pulled out a brown, leather-bound photo album. It was not the kind that was left out for guests, but a private one. It was a personal album, the kind with worn leather corners and a slightly loose spine. Catherine placed it on the coffee table in front of Lena without saying a word. Lena glanced from the album to Catherine, uncertain. "Open it," Catherine commanded, her voice sharp. When Lena opened the cover, her breath caught in her throat. This was not the man from the stern oil portrait on the wall. This was Jude as he really was. This was Jude in his everyday life. This was the Jude she had known as Jack. One photo showed him on a beach in Cape Cod, wearing a simple white t-shirt and shorts, his eyes narrowed with a smile against the bright sun. The next one captured him in a bar, a glass of beer in his hand, his head thrown back in laughter at something someone off camera said. Then there was a birthday picture. He stood in front of a cake, the candlelight flickering in his gray-blue eyes. And that smile, tilting just a little to the left, looked a bit shy, as if he was not used to being the center of attention. Lena paused on the beach photograph, her finger gently tracing the protective plastic. That smile always tilted to the left, and he always squinted in the sunlight instead of putting on sunglasses. She turned the page and stopped at the picture in the bar. He always held his glass with his left hand, she thought, even though he was right-handed, and whenever he laughed really hard, he would tilt his head back just like that and then run a hand through his hair, almost like he was embarrassed. Lena's voice started to shake. My daughter does the exact same thing. Phoebe runs her hand through her hair when she gets nervous. She tilts her head when she laughs. She is 4 years old, and she has mannerisms she has never seen anyone else do, because the only person who moves just like her vanished before she was even born. Catherine remained silent as Lena slowly flipped through the pages. But Lena saw that the woman's hand, which had been resting peacefully in her lap, was now clenching the edge of her blazer. Her knuckles were white from the pressure. It was the one detail that gave away Catherine Kensington's true feelings. Then Catherine stood, pulled her phone from her pocket, and dialed a number from memory. Brennan. Her voice was once again as cold as steel. I need a full background check on someone. Lena Ashford, 27 years old. I want every detail from 6 years ago until today. Where she has lived, her jobs, her medical history, everything. I want the results before the end of the night. She hung up and turned back to Lena, her face a perfect mask, revealing nothing of the emotions that had crossed it in the last 15 minutes. It was as if the conversation had been a simple business call. You will go back to work now, Catherine stated. Mrs. Patton is waiting for you in the East Corridor. You will complete your shift as planned. Nobody, and I mean nobody, is to know about this conversation. Not Mrs. Patton, not a single member of the staff, not anyone outside this room. Lena got to her feet, her legs still feeling weak. She simply nodded. Catherine moved closer, so close that Lena could see the fine veins on the back of the woman's hand, raised from gripping her blazer for so long. And Lena, she said, using her first name for the first time, not girl or the new hire, but Lena. The way she said it held a weight that Lena could not quite understand. If those results show that you are lying about even the smallest thing, you will wish you had never walked through those iron gates. The rest of the day felt like a hazy dream that Lena could not escape. She followed Mrs. Patton down the long east corridor, listening as the housekeeper laid out the cleaning routine for every room. She explained which polish to use for the oak floors, which cleaner was for marble, and how to fold the bath towels into a perfect fan shape, just as the Kensingtons required. Lena nodded, committed it all to memory, and repeated the instructions when asked. But her thoughts were a world away, caught between the oil painting, Catherine's ice-cold expression, and the gray-blue eyes she had seen every single day for 4 years in her own daughter's face. Are you all right? Mrs. Patton asked, after Lena had dropped a dustcloth for the 3rd time in just 10 minutes. You seem distracted. I'm sorry, Lena replied, quickly picking it up and forcing a smile. It's my first day. I'm just a little nervous. Mrs. Patton gave an understanding nod and did not ask any more questions. She was the kind of woman who sensed when to let things be, and for that, Lena was incredibly grateful. In the early afternoon, Mrs. Patton brought Lena to the master suite wing on the 2nd floor. This is Mr. Jude's room, she announced, pushing open a heavy oak door. He is currently in London, but Mrs. Kensington insists that it is kept in perfect condition, as if he might walk in at any time. As soon as Lena stepped inside, she felt a change in the air. The room was spacious, but surprisingly simple compared to the lavishness of the rest of the house. There was a king-sized bed with a dark wood frame, two nightstands with nothing but lamps on them, and a mahogany desk near the window that looked out over the garden. On the desk sat only a closed laptop and a picture frame that was turned face down. This was the room of a man who did not want to leave any part of himself behind, or perhaps it was the room of someone trying to erase him. Mrs. Patton told her to change the sheets and dust all the surfaces, then left to check on another part of the house, instructing Lena to finish her work and lock the door behind her. Alone in the room, Lena moved with caution, as if she were walking through a minefield. Her hands shook as she pulled the sheets off the bed, and when the scent rose from the pillow, she had to pause, clutching the fabric with her eyes shut. Wood and bergamot. It was Jack's scent, the scent she had breathed in every night they spent together in their tiny Dorchester apartment. It was the scent she had desperately tried to find on her own pillow for months after he disappeared, until it finally faded away, forcing her to accept that he was gone for good. And now, here it was, perfectly preserved, as if 5 years had never passed at all. Lena willed herself to keep moving, change the sheets, dust the furniture, straighten everything up. When she got to the desk, she carefully wiped around the laptop and the picture frame. On the pretext of cleaning behind it, she lifted the frame. The picture was of Jude with his parents at a graduation. Someone was handing him a diploma. Catherine stood to his right, wearing a rare smile, and a tall man with a stone-hard face stood on his left, who Lena guessed was Raymond Kensington. But it was not the photograph that made her heart stop. It was what lay hidden behind it. A small, round piece of cardboard with worn-out edges and a pale brown color. She knew what it was instantly, even before she turned it over, because she had seen thousands just like it during her 5 years as a waitress. It was a cardboard coaster, the kind they put under every coffee cup at Rosie's Cafe. The logo was almost completely faded, but she could still make out the shape of the rose and the tiny letters underneath it. Lena's fingers trembled so badly she almost dropped the coaster as she turned it over. On the back, written in slanted blue ink, was her own handwriting. It was her name, Lena. She remembered the moment clearly, like it was yesterday. It was the first day Jack had ever come into the cafe. He had asked for her name, but the place was so busy that she had just scribbled it on the coaster before rushing off to other tables. He had kept it. He had kept it from the very first day, for 5 whole years. He had carried it with him from Boston to London and hidden it behind a photograph on his desk, in a room he demanded be kept perfect, as if he were coming back any second. Lena put the frame back exactly where it had been, the coaster resting in her palm. It felt weightless, yet it was heavier than anything she had ever held. She stood there in Jude Kensington's room, surrounded by the scent of wood and bergamot, holding a coaster with her name on it. And for the first time in 5 years, she let a thought she had buried deep inside her come to the surface. Maybe he had not wanted to leave her. Maybe he never had a choice. At the end of the day, as the setting sun painted the tall mansion windows in shades of crimson, Lena was called to Catherine's study. This room was different from the main living room. It was smaller and more intimate, with a large wooden desk and bookshelves that reached from the floor to the ceiling. Catherine was seated behind the desk. On it was a thin brown file, the kind Lena knew did not come from a public records office. Catherine did not offer her a seat. She did not have to. Lena understood this was not going to be a friendly chat. Lena Ashford, Catherine began to read, her voice flat and completely without emotion. Entered the foster care system at age 3, placed with 4 different foster families in 13 years. Left the system at 16, worked as a waitress at Rosie's Cafe in South Boston from age 21 to 22. Left her job because of a pregnancy. Her daughter, Phoebe Ashford, was born at Boston Medical Center. She currently lives in apartment 312 of the Maple Building in Dorchester. Her annual income is below the federal poverty line. She closed the file. Everything matches up. Lena said nothing. She just reached into her apron, pocket, pulled out the coaster, and set it on the desk next to the file. Catherine glanced down, recognized the logo for Rosie's Cafe, and then turned it over. She saw the name Lena written in blue ink, and for the first time since Lena had walked into that house, Catherine Kensington's composure broke. It was only for a moment, a blink that lasted too long, a slightly deeper inhale, a swallow that she could not hide. But Lena saw it. "I found this in your son's room," Lena said softly. "It was hidden behind a picture frame. It's my name, in my handwriting. He has kept it for 5 years." Catherine did not touch the coaster. She just stared at it, as if it were the final piece of a puzzle she had been refusing to solve for half a decade. Then she leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window, where the Boston sky was shifting from red to a deep purple. 5 years ago, Catherine started, her voice completely changed. It was no longer cold and sharp, but low and heavy, like someone opening a box that had been sealed for far too long. Jude locked himself in his room for 3 days. He would not eat, he would not talk, and he would not open the door for anyone, not even me. She turned back to face Lena. When he finally came out of his room, he said only one sentence: "I have no reason left to stay." Then he finally agreed to take over the London branch of the business, a position he had refused for 2 full years before that day. He was on a flight that same week and has not come back since. Catherine placed her hand on the coaster, her fingers brushing lightly over the name Lena, in the same way she knew her son, thousands of miles away in London, still did each night before he slept. "I asked Raymond, my husband, if he knew what had happened to Jude. He said no. I believed him." She took a breath. "Now, I think he lied to me." Looking straight into Lena's eyes, Catherine spoke in a tone that was somewhere between a command and a request. "Bring the child here tomorrow. If she has Kensington blood, I will know it." The bus ride back to Dorchester had never seemed so long. Lena sat in the very last row, pressing her forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching the city of Boston pass by without really seeing any of it. The streetlights flickered on, their yellow light blurring through her teary eyes like stars falling backward out of the sky. Apron pocket. Her hand stayed wrapped tightly around her phone, as if it held the only evidence that the day's events were real and not some horrible waking nightmare. The bus hissed to a stop at the corner of Maple and Adams. Lena stepped off, pulling the familiar Dorchester twilight air into her lungs. The smell of fried food floated over from the corner market. Hip-hop music poured from a fifth-floor window somewhere overhead. At the end of the block, children shrieked with laughter on the small playground. She walked through the rusted iron gate of the Maple building, climbed 3 flights of stairs under hall lights that flickered like they were about to give up, and past the patch of peeling wall on the second floor that she had reported in March, which no one had fixed. But when she opened the door to apartment 312, the world outside disappeared. Inside, the apartment was small and crowded, but every corner was filled with the lives of 2 people. Phoebe's drawings covered the refrigerator door with houses in impossible colors, flowers taller than people, and cats with wings soaring across purple skies. A small pot of mint sat on the windowsill, the only plant that survived the winter because Phoebe insisted on watering it every single morning. The patchwork quilt that Dolly had sewn was draped over the old couch. Each square of fabric was a story the elderly woman told Phoebe on the nights she babysat. "Mama!" Phoebe shot out of the living room like a little cannonball. Her light brown hair was wild, her fierce, familiar eyes were blazing, and she was clutching Biscuit, her stuffed bear that was worn thin and missing an eye, but was still her most prized possession. Lena fell to her knees and hugged her daughter close, holding her so tight that Phoebe squealed, "Mama, I cannot breathe!" But she did not let go. She breathed in the scent of kids' shampoo in her daughter's hair, felt those tiny arms wrap around her neck, and for the first time all day, Lena felt solid ground under her feet. Dolly stood in the doorway, knitting needles in her hands, watching them with a gentle smile. "She was good today. We practiced counting to 100 in Spanish." Thank you, Miss Dolly, Lena said, fighting to keep her voice steady. You look tired, Dolly noted, peering over her reading glasses. That first day working for rich people must be hard. Harder than I ever thought, Lena answered. And that might have been the most honest thing she had said all day. After Dolly went home, Lena made dinner, which was scrambled eggs and toast. It was the meal Phoebe called breakfast at night, and she always giggled about it because it felt silly and backward. Lena sat across from her daughter at their tiny table, which was pushed up against the wall, and just watched her eat. And now, she could see everything. She saw the way Phoebe tilted her head when she chewed, which was exactly like Jude in the birthday photograph. She saw the way she held her glass of milk with her left hand, even though she was right-handed, just like Jack holding his beer in the photo album. And the dimple, that dimple that appeared when she laughed. The one feature Lena had always thought came from some distant, unknown relative, now had a name, a face, and a portrait hanging on a living room wall in a mansion in Beacon Hill. Late that night, Phoebe was sleeping curled up on their shared bed, with Biscuit tucked under her chin. Her mouth was slightly open, and her breathing was soft and even. Lena lay next to her but could not fall asleep. She pulled out her phone, turned the brightness all the way down, and opened her photo gallery. She swiped backward through time, past hundreds of pictures of Phoebe from the day she was born until now, past tired selfies taken after long night shifts, past photos of instant noodles at 2 in the morning when Phoebe was just learning to roll over until she finally found them. There were 4 photographs, all that was left of the 3 happiest months of her entire life. The first was a selfie they took in Boston Common when the leaves were changing color. Jack's arm was around her, and both of them were smiling, with the fiery red maple trees glowing behind them. The second picture was of Jack standing in the kitchen of this same apartment, the very kitchen where she had just cooked eggs tonight. He was wearing a striped apron, had tomato sauce smeared on his cheek, and was grinning sheepishly after he had burned a pot of instant noodles. The third was blurry and a little shaky because Lena had taken it in a rush. It showed Jack kissing her forehead in the rain at Faneuil Hall, with raindrops shining in his hair and his gray-blue eyes closed. The fourth picture was the last one. Jack was asleep on her sofa, with one arm tucked under his head. His face looked so peaceful. Lena remembered thinking that she wanted to wake up to that face every single morning for the rest of her life. 2 days after she took that picture, he disappeared. Lena turned off her phone and just stared at the ceiling. The crack was still there, zigzagging from the corner toward the middle of the room, exactly where it had been nearly 5 years ago when she was lying there, 7 months pregnant and all alone, not knowing what she was going to name her child or if she would be able to pay the rent next month. She remembered the nights she would wake up at 3 in the morning to feed Phoebe, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion, but too afraid to fall asleep for fear her daughter might choke. She remembered when Phoebe was 8 months old, going back to work while she was still breastfeeding, leaving her baby with Dolly from morning until night, and then coming home just to hold her and cry silently as the guilt ate her alive. She remembered the night Phoebe had a 104-degree fever when she was 8 months old. Lena had run 6 blocks, barefoot, through the freezing cold night to the emergency room at Boston Medical Center because she did not have enough money in her wallet for a taxi, singing lullabies the whole way while her tears soaked her shirt. She had not cried since that night. Not because she had run out of tears, but because she understood that tears did not buy milk, they did not pay the rent, and they did not cure a sick child. She did not have the luxury of being weak. Phoebe did not allow her to be weak. And now, tomorrow morning, she was going to bring her 4-year-old daughter to meet a grandmother she never knew she had, into a mansion she had never imagined, to prove that the blood in her veins connected her to a world that was millions of miles away from apartment 312 in the Maple Building. The next morning, Lena woke up early. She dressed Phoebe in her cleanest floral dress and combed her hair neatly, even though her daughter complained. "Today, you are going to meet a lady at Mama's work," Lena said, trying her best to make her tone sound completely normal. Phoebe looked up at her, her gray-blue eyes wide. Does she have cookies? Lena led Phoebe around to the back of the mansion, avoiding the main entrance, just like Catherine had told her to do the day before. The stone path curved through the southern garden, where the last hydrangeas of the season were still holding on to a faint shade of pale violet before the full force of a Boston winter arrived. Phoebe walked next to her mother, holding Lena's hand with one of hers, and Biscuit with the other. Her wide, curious eyes took in everything with the kind of excitement only a child can have. "Mama, this house is so big," she whispered, as if she was afraid someone might hear her. "Does a person live in all of these rooms?" "Yes, sweetheart," Lena answered, squeezing her daughter's hand a little tighter. The guest house was at the very end of the garden. It was a two-story building that was smaller than the main mansion, but was still 3 times the size of their apartment in Dorchester. Catherine Kensington was already on the porch, waiting for them. She had on a perfectly tailored cream suit, and her platinum hair was pinned back without a single strand out of place. Her back was as straight as a ruler, but she was not looking at Lena. Her eyes were locked on Phoebe from the moment the mother and daughter came into view at the start of the path, and she watched the child with an intensity that Lena could feel from 20 steps away. Phoebe felt it too. She stopped walking, tugged at her mother's hand, and slipped behind Lena's leg, gripping her worn companion tighter. "Mama," she whispered, her gray-blue eyes blinking. "She is looking at me strangely." Lena placed a comforting hand on her daughter's head, smoothing down her light brown hair. "It is okay, sweetheart. She just wants to meet you." Catherine had heard Phoebe's small voice, and Lena watched as the older woman took a deep, steadying breath before descending from the porch. She moved with a slow, deliberate pace, each step careful, as if worried that any sudden movement might scare the child. When she was just 2 steps away, she stopped and lowered herself slightly. It was not a kneel, because Catherine Kensington did not kneel for anyone, but it was enough to bring her face closer to Phoebe's level. "Hello," she said, and her voice was softer than Lena had ever heard it before. It was so gentle that it was almost unrecognizable from the woman who had made threats in the living room just the day before. "You are Phoebe, are you not?" Phoebe nodded, still mostly concealed behind her mother's leg, but her curious eyes peeked out from around Lena's hip. "Do you have any cookies?" Catherine blinked once, and then her lips stretched into a smile so rare that Lena was sure very few people on Earth had ever witnessed it. "I do," she replied. "I have many cookies. Come on inside, and I will show you." Inside the guest house, the living room felt much warmer than Lena had anticipated. There was a sofa covered in a floral print, white lace curtains, and a tray of fresh golden cookies on the coffee table. Next to the cookies sat a pitcher of apple juice and 3 glasses, 2 large and 1 small. Catherine had prepared everything, arranged it all so carefully, and that gesture spoke volumes more to Lena than words ever could. The moment she saw the cookies, Phoebe's shyness vanished. She shot a look at her mother, asking for permission. Lena gave a slight nod, and Phoebe immediately settled onto the edge of the sofa. She picked out a single cookie and took a tiny bite. Her eyes instantly lit up. "This is good," she announced with a huge grin. And then a dimple appeared on her plump cheek. It was deep and clear, a perfect match, down to the finest detail. To the dimple in Jude's birthday photograph Lena had been looking at in the album just yesterday. Catherine brought a hand to her chest, her fingers balling up the fabric of her suit right over her heart, and Lena noticed her knuckles turning white. "Jude loved these when he was a little boy," Catherine said, her voice shaking. It was genuinely trembling for the first time since Lena had met her. The phrase, "when he was a little boy," escaped her lips, weighed down by 40 years of memories. Mrs. Cook would bake them every Sunday. He would always grab the most and hide them in his coat pockets to take upstairs. Phoebe did not grasp the history behind those words, but she felt the kindness in the elderly woman's voice. So she held out her half-eaten cookie as an offering. "Do you want some? It is really good." Catherine gently shook her head, but the smile never faded from her face. Her eyes were glistening with tears, and she made no effort to wipe them away. Or maybe she simply could not. After Phoebe had eaten her second cookie, she became more courageous. She started to explore the living room, feeling the fabric of the sofa, looking at the vase on the windowsill, and then she recalled the small backpack she had brought along. "Mama, can I show her my drawing book?" Lena nodded, her heart starting to pound faster. She knew exactly what was in that book. Phoebe unzipped her backpack and took out the well-used sketchbook, its cover adorned with stickers of stars and cats. She climbed onto the sofa next to Catherine, moving with such ease that it took both Lena and Catherine by surprise, and opened the book. The pages were filled with a child's crayon drawings. There was a house with smoke spiraling out of the chimney, flowers that were half the size of the page, and a smiling sun. Catherine looked at each page, nodding and offering soft praise, until Phoebe turned to a specific drawing and paused. "This one is my favorite," she said with all the gravity a 4-year-old could muster. The picture showed 3 figures holding hands. The smallest one was in the middle, with brown hair and a floral dress, obviously Phoebe. To the left stood a taller figure with long hair, Mama. On the right was the tallest figure, drawn with less detail, with short hair, and positioned a little apart from the other two, as if the young artist was not sure how close he should be. "This is Mama. This is me. And this," Phoebe said, pointing to the figure on the right, "is Daddy." Catherine stared at the drawing, and then she looked at Phoebe. "Is your daddy very far away?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Phoebe nodded with great seriousness. "Very far. But Mama says Daddy loves me. He just has to be somewhere that is very, very far away." Catherine then turned to look at Lena. Her eyes no longer held any of the coldness, the sharpness, the doubt, or the disdain that Lena had seen the day before. In its place was an emotion so complex, it took Lena a moment to unravel it. It was respect, because Lena had taught her daughter that her father loved her, rather than teaching the child to hate him. It was pain, because she was looking at the 4-year-old granddaughter she should have known since the day she was born. And it was shame, a profound shame that only a guilty conscience can produce, because she was starting to realize that her own family had stolen something from this little girl that no amount of cookies or fancy houses could ever give back. Just then, the ringing of a phone shattered the silence. Catherine pulled it from her pocket, looked at the screen, and her entire expression changed instantly. She stood up, muttered, "Excuse me," and went out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. Lena could hear the muffled sound of her voice through the glass. It was low but firm. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." "Fine. No, do not ask. Just get back here." When Catherine came back inside, her face was composed again, but a fresh tension was visible around her eyes. "There has been a change of plans," she announced, looking directly at Lena. "Jude has moved up his ticket. He is going to arrive tomorrow morning." Lena felt the ground shift beneath her. Tomorrow morning. Not over the weekend. Not next week. Tomorrow. "I am not ready," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. They were the most honest words she had spoken in the last 2 days. Catherine observed her for a long moment, then her gaze shifted to Phoebe, who was now using a crayon to add another yellow flower to the family portrait, completely oblivious that her entire world was on the verge of changing forever. "No one is ever truly ready for something like this," Catherine stated, her voice quiet. It was not cold, but it was heavy. It was heavy, like the voice of someone bearing the weight of a monumental decision. "But my son has already lost 5 years. He should not have to lose another day." More than 5,000 miles away, in a 6th-floor suite at Claridge's in the center of London, Jude Kensington was sitting by the window, gazing down at Mayfair at midnight. A light mist coated the window pane, and tiny droplets of water traced random paths down the glass, much like the life paths he had never taken. The glass of whiskey on the marble ledge had been empty for a long time, leaving just a faint amber residue at the bottom, and the lingering smell of peat smoke in the room. Next to it, on the cold stone, was a small round piece of cardboard. Its edges were frayed and its color had faded to a pale brown. It was so old, it was almost falling apart at the seams. It was a coaster from Rosie's Cafe. Jude picked it up and flipped it over, looking at the slanted handwriting in blue ink. It had faded a little over time but was still easy to read. Lena. He ran his thumb over the name slowly, as if he were afraid that pressing too hard would make it vanish, just like the woman with that name had vanished from his life. No, not vanished. The way he had ripped her out of his own life, convincing himself it was for her own protection. The door opened. Brennan walked in without knocking, a right he had earned after 10 years of service at Jude's side, through tense negotiations in dark rooms, through countless sleepless nights, and through making choices that regular men would never face. He noticed the coaster in Jude's hand and showed no surprise, because this was not the first time he had seen it. Not the 10th, not the 100th. "Boss, your mother called," Brennan said in a neutral tone. "She wants you to take an earlier flight tomorrow morning." Jude did not look up. "The reason?" "She did not say, only that it is important, and she needs you to come home right away." Jude stayed quiet, his eyes locked on the coaster. Brennan stood with his arms crossed, watching his employer with the patience of a man who has seen too much. Then he let out a soft, barely audible sigh. "It has been 5 years, boss," Brennan said. His voice was not accusatory, just tired. It was the kind of weariness that comes from saying the same thing over and over, all while knowing the response will not change. "You should let it go." Jude finally raised his head. His gray-blue eyes, the very same eyes that a 4-year-old girl halfway across the world shared, a fact he was completely unaware of, met Brennan's gaze with a quiet sadness. "I have let go of everything else in my life, Brennan," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I let go of my dream to be an architect when my father told me to take a seat at the director's table. I let go of the freedom to choose my own path the day I inherited the Kensington name. I even let go of the only woman who ever saw me for who he was, and not for his money, his power, or the fear he inspired." His eyes fell back to the coaster. "Except for this. This is the one thing I cannot let go of." Brennan did not say another word. He had realized a long time ago that some fights were not worth fighting, and the coaster with Lena's name on it was one of them. Jude got to his feet and put the coaster into the inside pocket of his jacket, on the left side, directly over his heart. It was in the precise spot where it had remained for the past 5 years, through every board meeting, every formal dinner, and every long night in the empty silence of his London suite. "Book the flight for tomorrow morning," Jude said as he walked past Brennan toward the closet and started to pack. Brennan nodded and pulled out his phone. But before he turned around, he took one last look at his employer, a powerful mafia boss on the East Coast was carefully folding shirts into a suitcase. Just 12 hours earlier, those same hands had approved a $200 million deal. He couldn't decide if fate was playing a cruel joke or starting something new. Catherine Kensington had called her son home on the exact night he found himself staring at a worn piece of cardboard once again. Jude had no idea. He didn't know that a woman was also awake in a small apartment in Dorchester, Boston, looking at old photos and counting the hours. And he didn't know that in 12 hours, the past he had fought to bury for 5 years would be standing in his family's living room. It would have his own gray-blue eyes, set in the face of a 4-year-old child he never knew existed. That morning, Lena decided against her uniform. She stood in front of the small bathroom mirror in her apartment, her face illuminated by the flickering fluorescent light. She then put away the crisp housemaid uniform she had set out on her bed. Instead, she picked out a simple, black dress. It was the only piece of clothing in her closet that was not for work. She had bought it on sale at a thrift store 2 years ago for a job interview she didn't get. The dress was old, but it fit her perfectly. The soft cotton moved with her body. It was formal enough that she would not feel out of place, yet simple enough that she still felt like herself. She let her hair down instead of pulling it back into its usual tight knot. After one last look in the mirror, she turned away. If she was going to face Jude Kensington, she would do it as Lena Ashford, not as his housekeeper. The morning bus dropped her off in Beacon Hill at 7:45. The moment she walked through the mansion's iron gates, she knew something was different. A sleek black Audi was parked near the main entrance, a car that was not there 2 days ago. He was home. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel the pulse in her throat. She walked to the main entrance instead of the staff door. Mrs. Patton opened it. The housekeeper's eyes briefly widened when she saw Lena in the black dress, but she said nothing. She just nodded her head and moved aside, as if someone had told her this morning would be anything but normal. Lena walked across the marble foyer, the quiet clicks of her low heels echoing on the polished floor. She moved down a hallway she had already memorized after only 2 days, passing by oil paintings and crystal chandeliers. She stopped in front of the large double oak doors of the main living room. From inside, she heard a man's voice, deep and steady. Her entire body went rigid, as if someone had just poured ice water down her back. It had been 5 years since she had heard that voice. For 5 years, she thought she had forgotten it. She was wrong. Lena knocked. "Come in," Catherine's voice answered. It was calm but strained, like a wire pulled almost to its breaking point. Lena pushed the door open. Catherine was sitting in her usual armchair to the left of the fireplace. Her back was straight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. And to the right of the fireplace, with his back to the door, stood a tall man in a gray suit. He held a coffee cup in one hand, while the other was tucked casually into his pocket. He was saying something to his mother. His voice was warm and relaxed, the sound of a man who had just come home after a long trip, completely unaware that everything had changed while he was away. Then he turned, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. It was those eyes, that unforgettable, haunting stare she had never been able to forget. 5 years had etched new lines onto his face, making him look harder, more tired. There were hints of silver at his temples, and his jaw was set tight, like a man who grinds his teeth at night. But his eyes were exactly the same. They were the eyes she had looked into every morning for 3 months, the eyes she now saw every single day on her daughter's face. The coffee cup in Jude's hand tilted, almost slipping from his grasp. He caught it just in time, but hot, dark drops splashed onto his skin. The liquid had to be scalding, but he didn't seem to notice. His entire body had gone stiff. Only his eyes moved, widening and blinking fast, as if his brain was refusing to believe what it was seeing. "Lena," he breathed. The name was a hoarse whisper, more like a gust of air than a word, as if saying her name had sucked all the oxygen from the room. Lena just stood there, her arms hanging loosely at her sides, her back straight, her eyes locked on his. She had spent the whole night preparing for this, going over the words she would say. But now, seeing him in person, all the rehearsed lines disappeared from her mind. All that was left was the truth. "Hello, Jack," she said, her voice much calmer than she felt. Or maybe I should say, Jude Kensington, the mafia boss whose real name I never knew. Jude placed his coffee cup on the mantel. His hand was shaking so much that the cup made a sharp clinking sound against the marble. He looked over at his mother, pure panic flashing across the face of the most powerful man on the East Coast. In that moment, he looked like a little boy who had just been caught. "Mother," he stammered, his voice cracking. "What is going on?" Catherine didn't get up. She didn't even move. Her posture remained perfect. Her expression never changed. She just stared at her son with the eyes of a woman who had been planning this confrontation for 2 days. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so calm, it was cruel. It was as calm as someone reading a weather report, as if her next words held no power to destroy everything in the room. You have a daughter, Jude. She is 4 years old. Her name is Phoebe. A heavy silence filled the space. It wasn't an awkward silence or a thoughtful one. It was the kind of silence that happens in the moment after a bomb is dropped, but before it hits the ground. That single suspended second when everything is still whole, but everyone knows it is about to be shattered. Jude looked from his mother to Lena, and then back to his mother again. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His right hand fumbled behind him until it found the back of a chair, and he gripped it so hard his knuckles turned white. All the color drained from his face, so much so that Lena could see the faint blue veins throbbing at his temple. And those gray-blue eyes, which only 12 hours ago had stared out at the city with a familiar loneliness, were now wide with an emotion far beyond simple surprise. It was pure shock, the kind of raw shock that makes your body forget how to work. Daughter, Jude repeated, the word falling from his lips like a heavy stone. 4 years. Catherine gave a single firm nod. The woman standing before you is the child's mother. She came here for a job. She recognized your portrait on the wall. I have spent the last 2 days confirming her story. Everything checks out. Jude spun back to Lena, his eyes desperately searching her face for some sign that this was all a terrible mistake. Lena offered him no such comfort. She stood tall, arms at her sides, and began to speak. Her voice was steady and cool. There were no tears, no trembling, no begging for sympathy. 6 weeks after you vanished, I discovered I was pregnant, she said. I tried to find you. The phone number you gave me was disconnected. No one at the cafe knew you. All I had was a fake name and a handful of memories. I gave birth by myself at Boston Medical Center. No one was there to hold my hand. She paused, not for emotion, but just to take a breath. I have raised Phoebe on my own from her very first day. I worked 2 jobs every day. There were months I couldn't afford formula, so I went without meals to make sure she had enough to eat. When Phoebe was 8 months old, she spiked a 104-degree fever in the middle of the night. I ran 6 blocks barefoot to the emergency room because I didn't have enough money for a taxi in December. Every sentence was like a sharp knife, and Lena knew it. But she was not trying to hurt him. She was simply stating the facts, and the facts themselves were cruel enough. I did not come here looking for you, she finished, her tone even. I had no idea who you were until I saw that painting. I came for this job because the pay is 3 times what I made at the cafe, and my daughter needs to eat. That is all. At some point, Jude had collapsed into the armchair. He was bent over, with his elbows on his knees and his hands clutching his head. His shoulders were shaking slightly. When he finally looked up, his gray-blue eyes were bloodshot and glistening, filled with tears that refused to fall. I did not know, he said, his voice completely broken. Lena, I swear to you, I did not know. If I had known... What would you have done? Lena asked. It was not a bitter question. She genuinely wanted to know. Jude looked at her, then stared down at his own hands, as if the answer was written on his palms. Then he began to speak. My father found out about us, he said, his voice growing quiet and heavy, like a man prying open a casket that had been sealed for 5 years. Raymond Kensington does not tolerate surprises. He had you, followed me. He knew absolutely everything. Your address, your job, the exact times you came and went. Then he summoned me to his office. Jude swallowed hard. He ordered me to break things off with you at once. I told him no. The very next day, you were let go from Rosie's. Lena winced. She could still see that morning, the owner calling her into the back, refusing to look her in the eye while he talked about staff reductions. His voice had been shaky, and she had taken him at his word, believing she was just the unlucky person whose name came up. My father purchased the entire building that the cafe was in, Jude went on, every word a struggle. He did it all just to have you thrown out. And he told me, This is just the beginning. If you refuse to listen, the next move will not be so civilized. I know my father, Lena. He does not make empty threats. He possesses the influence, the resources, and the cold heart to follow through. His voice cracked on the final words. I walked away because I was terrified he would come after you. I convinced myself that if I was gone, he would leave you in peace. It felt like the only way to keep you safe. Catherine then spoke, her tone deep and somber. Raymond is a man from a different time, she explained, her gaze drifting to the window where morning light poured through the tall panes. To him, bloodline means everything. Social standing means everything. I am not making excuses for my husband. I just want you to see that Jude did not make this choice under normal conditions. Lena was listening. She took in every single word, processed every single detail, and felt two powerful emotions flowing within her, like parallel rivers that could never touch. The first was rage, a rage she had held onto for 5 long years. Rage for the man who disappeared and abandoned her. The other was a painful recognition, the awful truth that he had not left because he fell out of love with her, but because his love was so strong it made him a coward. And that realization was 1,000 times more painful than anger. You took away my choice, Lena said, and this time her voice was shaking, genuinely shaking. The anger and the understanding were ripping her apart inside. You made the decision for me that I required protection that looked like desertion. You thought you were being heroic by making a sacrifice. But have you ever considered what that sacrifice did to me? Or to your own daughter? Jude offered no response. He simply stared at her, his gray-blue eyes drowning in regret. This was not the shallow remorse of a man who had been caught. It was the kind of regret that eats you alive from the inside, the kind that had been his constant companion every day and every night in that London suite, right next to the coaster that had her name on it. Phoebe, he murmured, her name shattering into pieces as it came out. Can I please see her? Lena observed him for what felt like an eternity. She looked at those tear-filled gray-blue eyes, the same eyes that gazed back at her each morning from her daughter's face while asking what they were having for breakfast. She studied the trembling hands of the East Coast's most formidable crime boss. She looked at the man who had shattered her heart into 1,000,000 pieces, but had also given her the single most precious gift of her life. Yes, Lena finally said. But if you ever vanish on us again, Jude Kensington, I do not care who you are or how much power you think you have. I promise you will not be getting a third chance. Jude drove with his eyes locked on the road, his hands squeezing the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Lena was in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap as she gazed out the window. Not a word was spoken between them. Boston slid by their windows, from the charming brick streets of Beacon Hill to the broad avenues of downtown, before shifting into neighborhoods that were older, grittier, and more real. 10 minutes crawled by, filled only with the drone of the engine and the faint sound of distant traffic. 10 minutes where every single second felt heavy and suffocating as they were both lost in their own internal tempests. Lena was the one who finally broke the silence, not out of a desire to talk, but because the quiet was becoming unbearable. She loves to draw, she said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the scenery outside. Just like you. Jude chanced a look at her, the first since they had entered the car. Like me. You have no idea, Lena answered. Phoebe spends all day drawing houses, every single kind. Houses with big gardens, houses with tall chimneys, houses with balconies overflowing with flowers. She draws them so much. Her preschool teacher even asked me one time if I was an architect. She took a breath. She draws houses as if she is looking for a place to call home, but has not found it yet. Jude did not respond. He turned his attention back to the road, but Lena could see his jaw clench, a muscle twitching just under his skin. When the Audi made the turn onto Maple Street, he eased his foot off the gas. He stared through the windshield at the apartment building, at the rusted iron gate, the cracked concrete stairs, the dingy outer wall covered in graffiti, and the clotheslines stretched between balconies on the fourth floor. This was the place his daughter called home. This was the place where, while he was living in a luxurious suite at Claridge's with a view of Mayfair, Phoebe was asleep in a tiny apartment, sharing a bed with her mother, and holding a well-loved stuffed bear named Biscuit. "I do not feel pity," Jude said in a low voice as he switched off the engine, his gaze still fixed on the building. "I feel ashamed." Lena said nothing. She just opened her door and got out of the car. Jude followed her. They walked up 3 flights of stairs in silence, passing by flickering lights in the hallway, walls with peeling plaster, and the smell of fried food coming from an apartment on the second floor. Jude did not complain or even react. He just took it all in, his eyes cataloging every single hardship his daughter had faced for 4 years because of a choice he had made. Lena rapped on Dolly's apartment door. It swung open, and before Lena could even say a word, a small, brown-haired blur shot out toward her. "Mama!" Phoebe threw her arms around her mother's leg, her face turned up, her gray-blue eyes sparkling. And then she noticed Jude. She stopped moving, tilting her head slightly to one side, precisely the way Jude did when he was evaluating a new situation, precisely the way she had done when she first saw Catherine. Her curious eyes traveled from his polished leather shoes all the way up to his face, finally resting on his eyes. 2 identical sets of eyes locked, a mirror showing 2 completely different worlds. Then Phoebe ducked behind her mother's leg, clutching her one-eyed bear even more tightly. "Mama," she whispered, "I do not like strangers." Lena placed a comforting hand on her daughter's hair. "It is all right, sweetie." She looked over at Jude, and he understood the silent message. He took 1 step back, and then another, giving the little girl her space. He did not move forward. He did not bend down to try and force a conversation. He did not do any of the things an impatient adult would do. He simply stood there, and he waited. Inside Dolly's living room, a little drawing table was set up in a corner. Phoebe went back to her spot, pulled out her box of crayons, and started to draw, acting as if Jude was not even there. Jude looked at Lena for guidance. She gave him the tiniest shake of her head, a clear signal not to force the issue. He nodded in understanding, and then he did something Lena never would have guessed. He brought over a small chair, sat down at the table next to Phoebe, picked up a clean sheet of paper and a couple of crayons, and he started to draw. He did not say a word, did not even look at her. He just drew. He sketched a house with clean lines and perfect proportions, complete with a porch that had columns, large windows, and steps leading to the front door. He just sat there drawing with a crayon on plain paper, a powerful mafia boss, sitting on a tiny plastic chair in a Dorchester apartment, creating the most incredible house that crayons could possibly make. Phoebe peeked at him from the side. She signed. She scooted her chair a bit closer, and then a little closer still. She opened her sketchbook to a specific page and laid it down between them. It showed 3 figures holding hands. Mama, Phoebe, and a third, roughly drawn figure with short hair, standing a little bit apart. "Who is this?" Jude asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That is my daddy," Phoebe replied seriously. "Mama says Daddy went very far away, but I still draw him." Jude turned his head away sharply. His shoulders were trembling. From the corner of the room, Lena saw him quickly raise a hand to his eyes, as if he were wiping away sweat. But it was not sweat. The most ruthless mafia boss on the East Coast was crying over a child's crayon drawing. Then Phoebe added softly, with the brutal honesty that only a child possesses, "Tommy has a daddy. Maya has a daddy. Everybody has a daddy." She looked down at her drawing. "I do not." The silence in the room became so thick it was hard to breathe. And then Phoebe did something that no one could have predicted. She carefully tore the drawing out of her sketchbook, smoothed it flat on the table, and held it out to Jude with both of her tiny hands. "For you," she said with a serious look, "because you look sad." Jude took the paper with both of his hands. The hands that had signed million-dollar contracts, that had gripped their way through life and death negotiations, that held the power of an underground empire, were now holding a thin piece of crayon-marked paper as if it were the most fragile and precious thing he had ever touched. "Thank you," he said, and his voice broke completely on those two words. "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." On the drive back in the black Audi, the drawing sat on Jude's lap. He did not say anything for 5 whole minutes. Lena stayed silent too, giving him the space that she knew he needed. Then Jude finally spoke, his voice low and steady. It was no longer shattered, but instead fused together by something new, something that was harder than steel and deeper than regret. "I have lost 4 years," he said, his eyes fixed on the road in front of them. "I will not lose another day." Jude kept his promise. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. A month went by, and Jude Kensington did not miss a single visit. He did not arrive a minute late, even when it meant he would leave a board meeting in the middle of a presentation, reschedule a critical call with his London partners, or battle rush hour traffic across Boston, all to arrive at the Dorchester apartment at 4 o'clock, exactly when he promised. At first, Phoebe still called him Uncle Jude. She kept a careful distance between them, always holding her stuffed bear, Biscuit, like a little shield. But children have a unique way of sensing who is genuine, and their instincts are sharper than any adult invention. Phoebe tested Jude with her patience. She noticed how he never pushed her to speak when she was quiet, and how he always sat on the floor to be at her eye level. She saw that he remembered she liked purple crayons more than blue, and that Biscuit needed his very own chair whenever they had cookies. Slowly, the distance between them shrank. The worn-out stuffed animal went from being a barrier to a mutual friend. Then came a Tuesday afternoon. Jude, dressed in a $3,000 suit, sat cross-legged on the old rug in the apartment, having a tea party with Phoebe and her plastic toy set. The silent guest of honor, Biscuit the bear, had his own seat with a pink plastic cup set neatly in front of him. Phoebe carefully poured imaginary tea into Jude's cup, looking as serious as a real hostess. "This is your tea," she announced. "There is no sugar, because you told me you do not like it." Jude took a sip from the tiny cup with the same focused expression he used when signing million-dollar contracts. "This is excellent," he said seriously. "You make better tea than Brennan." Phoebe's face broke into a huge laugh, her dimples showing, and Lena, standing in the kitchen doorway with her coffee mug, had to bite her lip to keep her emotions from overflowing. And then, the day finally came. It was nothing special, just a normal Saturday afternoon. Jude had taken Phoebe and Lena to the grocery store because Phoebe desperately wanted a chocolate cereal that her mom never bought, saying it was too expensive. They were walking down the aisle, with Phoebe sitting in the shopping cart, kicking her legs and looking at all the bright colors on the shelves. She suddenly pointed to a box high on the top shelf, the one with the cartoon rabbit she loved, far out of her reach and even out of Lena's. Without a second thought, without even a pause, Phoebe turned to the man beside her and said, "Daddy, can you get that for me?" Jude stopped dead in the middle of the aisle. His hand was already reaching for the box, his fingers just touching the cardboard, and he froze right there, like a statue. His eyes filled with tears almost instantly. It happened so fast that Lena knew he had no time to prepare himself, no time to put up his emotional walls or wear his usual tough guy mask. There he was, in a busy supermarket, holding a cereal box with a cartoon rabbit, his eyes glistening as the word "Daddy" echoed in his head. It was a sound he never knew he had been waiting his entire life to hear. "Daddy," Phoebe said again, confused by why he had stopped moving. "I want that one." Jude swallowed hard, blinked a few times, and carefully placed the cereal box in the cart. "Of course, Princess," he said. His voice was a little shaky, but his smile was the biggest Lena had ever seen. Back at the mansion on Beacon Hill, Catherine Kensington was also changing. Every weekend, Phoebe would visit the estate, and the powerful matriarch who had helped run an underground empire for 40 years would now be found sitting on the floor, playing dolls with her granddaughter. She taught Phoebe how to make things out of clay, and told her stories about Jude when he was a little boy. For the first time in many years, the sound of a child's laughter filled the mansion's rooms, which had long been silent and full of secrets. Brennan was the first person to really notice the difference in Jude. One evening, Jude was leaving the Dorchester apartment after reading Phoebe a bedtime story. Brennan was waiting by the car and saw his boss walking toward him with a smile still lingering on his face. "You are different, boss," Brennan commented. Jude just looked at him. "It is your smile," Brennan explained, his tone full of surprise. "I have worked for you for 10 years. I have never seen you smile that way before." Jude did not reply, but he knew Brennan was right. He started turning down certain types of meetings, the ones that were never on any official schedule, held in the basements of restaurants or the back rooms of clubs, the kind of meetings he used to never miss. He began to delegate his responsibilities one by one, like a man carefully taking apart a tower he had spent 15 years building, starting from the very top, slowly but surely. Meanwhile, on the refrigerator in the Dorchester apartment, a new drawing by Phoebe was held in the most important spot by a flower-shaped magnet. It showed 3 people holding hands. Mama was on the left, Phoebe was in the middle, and on the right was Daddy. For the very first time, he was not drawn off to the side, or as a faint outline at the edge of the paper. This time, Daddy was right there beside them, holding his daughter's hand and holding Mama's hand. He was drawn big and clear and colored in with the darkest black crayon in the box, as if Phoebe wanted to make sure that this time, Daddy was not going to disappear. The picnic was Jude's idea. He brought it up on a Friday night while the 3 of them were sitting on the floor of the small apartment, eating pizza because their table was not big enough for all of them. Phoebe had declared it the best pizza party ever, even though it was just a $12 pizza from the shop on the corner. "The weather is supposed to be nice tomorrow," Jude said, looking over at Lena. "We could go to Walden Pond, just the 3 of us, if you want to." Lena paused for a moment. This would be the first time they had gone out somewhere as a real family. Not in the safety of her apartment, and not on the protected grounds of his mansion, but out in the open world, where anyone could see them and think they were just like any other family. "Okay," she finally agreed. On Saturday morning, the black Audi drove out of Boston and headed west. Phoebe was buckled into the car seat that Jude had bought last week, with Biscuit in her lap, and she was talking a mile a minute. She told them all about a boy at her preschool named Tommy, who had just lost his first tooth. She talked about how her teacher, Miss Teresa, showed her how to make butterflies with finger paints. She explained that her doll, Dolly, was knitting a little wool hat for Biscuit because winter was coming and bears can get cold too. Jude drove the car, looking in the rearview mirror to watch his daughter. He answered all of her questions, nodded at the right moments, and acted surprised when he was supposed to. Lena sat in the passenger seat, watching both of them in that same mirror, and she felt a warmth spreading inside her that she was afraid to give a name to. Then, right in the middle of her story about the butterflies, Phoebe asked a question. She said it so casually, as if she were asking about the sky. "Daddy, why were you not with Mama in the beginning?" The car suddenly became silent, as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over them. Lena felt like she could not breathe. Her hand tightened on the seat. In the mirror, she saw Jude's grip on the steering wheel get tighter. His jaw was clenched, but he did not avoid the question. He did not try to change the subject, or say something like, "You will understand when you are older." Instead, he answered, "Because Daddy did something very wrong," Jude said, speaking slowly and carefully, like someone testing thin ice. "Daddy thought that staying away would keep Mama safe, but it just made her sad instead. And because of that, Daddy missed a lot of time with you." Phoebe was quiet for a moment, thinking about this in the way that only a 4-year-old can. Then she said, "But Daddy is here now." "Yes," Jude replied, his voice filled with emotion. "Daddy is here now, and Daddy is never going away again." Right. Never. Pinky promise? Jude looked into the rearview mirror. Phoebe was holding up her tiny pinky finger with great seriousness. As if it were the most important promise in the world, he reached his right hand back, and her small finger wrapped around his. His big, rough finger gently held hers in a way that only a father can with his child. Pinky promise, Jude said. Walden Pond on an autumn morning was so beautiful it almost did not look real. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the blue sky and the trees that were changing from green to shades of gold and bright red. The air was cool and fresh and smelled like damp leaves. They laid out Dolly's handmade quilt under a large oak tree near the water and set out the food that Jude had picked up from a deli on their way. There were sandwiches, fruit, juice, and a box of cookies that Phoebe had to bring because, as she said, "These are the kind Grandma Catherine gives me. They are the best." After they ate, Phoebe got out the watercolor paint set Jude had bought for her and sat on the edge of the blanket, painting a picture of the lake. She was completely focused, with her head down and her tongue sticking out a little, while the two adults leaned against the tree trunk, their shoulders almost touching, just watching her. "Lena," Jude said, and his voice was different now. He was not talking like a daddy to his little girl anymore, but like a man talking to the woman he loved. His voice was low and trembled just a little. "I want a second chance." Lena kept her eyes on Phoebe, who was mixing blue and white paint to get the color of the water just right. "And not just because of Phoebe," Jude went on, "even though she is the most important reason. It is because of us. Because whatever we had between us, it never really went away." He paused for a moment and then added quietly, almost speaking to himself, 5 years, Lena. 5 years. I kept that coaster with your name on it in my jacket pocket. I carried it from Boston to London, and I put it on my nightstand every single night. Brennan thinks I am crazy. He managed a small, sad smile. Maybe I am. But I met a lot of people in those 5 years, and not a single one of them was you. Lena finally turned and looked at him. His gray-blue eyes met hers, and they were filled with complete honesty. There was no tough guy armor, no walls up around his heart. There was only the man she had fallen in love with 5 years ago, sitting under a tree by a lake, asking her for a chance. "I am scared," she admitted, speaking more honestly than she had in a long time. "I am scared of your world, Jude. It is dangerous. It took you away from me once before. Could take you again, or worse, it could get to Phoebe." Jude did not argue with her. He did not make grand promises, and he did not offer her empty words of comfort. He just said, "Do not believe my words. Watch my actions. I will prove it to you every day." Before Lena could reply, Phoebe ran over to them, holding up her still damp painting, her eyes shining with excitement. "Look!" she cried, lifting it up between them. It was a picture of a blue lake with red and gold trees, and in the middle there were 3 figures standing side by side at the edge of the water. It was not the old drawing of 3 people holding hands with the daddy far away in the corner. This time, the 3 of them stood shoulder to shoulder, and above their heads, in clumsy letters that Phoebe had just learned how to write, was one word: family. Lena looked at the painting, then she looked at Phoebe, and then she looked at Jude. She placed her hand over his, slowly and gently, but with a feeling of certainty. It was the first time in 5 years that she had reached out to him. "One step at a time," she whispered, her voice steady, despite its softness. "But together." Jude turned his hand upward, weaving his fingers through hers, and they sat there together, underneath the oak tree. Model. Lena watched Phoebe chase a butterfly toward the lake, a perfect family portrait on the patchwork blanket between them. On the ride home, Phoebe was asleep in her car seat, a half-eaten biscuit nestled under her chin. Her lips were slightly parted, her breathing soft and steady. The Audi moved smoothly down the highway as the Boston skyline appeared in the violet and red colors of twilight. Over the center console, Lena and Jude held hands without saying a word. They didn't need to. For the first time in 5 long years, the quiet between them was not filled with loss or anger, but with peace. It was the comfortable silence of two people who had finally found their way back to each other. Everything felt so perfect that a sense of fear started to creep into Lena's mind. It was not the old fear of being broke or alone, but a new fear of happiness. She was afraid because every morning Phoebe would hear the doorbell, scream, "Daddy!" and throw herself at Jude's legs. Her smile was so big, so bright. Lena knew that if that smile ever disappeared, it would shatter Phoebe in a way that 4 years without a father never could. This time, her daughter knew exactly what she would be losing. Lena felt fear every morning when she made coffee for Jude, black with no sugar, and set it on the small kitchen table. He would take a sip, look at her with those gray-blue eyes that had captivated her 5 years ago, and she could feel herself falling for him all over again. She felt fear when Catherine Kensington, the formidable head of the family, invited all three of them for dinner. They were not sent to the guest house or a hidden corner, but to the main table in the Beacon Hill mansion, where every important family dinner had taken place for 50 years. Phoebe sat in a new high chair Catherine had bought just for her, with her teddy bear, Biscuit, in the seat next to her. Phoebe insisted the bear needed a spot, and to Lena's surprise, Catherine agreed without a protest. It was an acceptance more powerful than words. Everything was wonderful. And Lena was terrified because life had taught her that nothing beautiful ever lasts. Then she noticed the SUV. She first saw it on Tuesday, picking Phoebe up from Pano Solis preschool. A black SUV with dark-tinted windows was parked across the street, about 100 feet from the entrance. At first, Lena dismissed it. Boston was filled with black SUVs. But when she returned on Thursday, the same vehicle was there. It was in the exact same spot, with the same license plate. This time, the driver's window rolled down just enough for Lena to see a man's face staring right at the school gate, where Phoebe was running out with her favorite stuffed animal. Lena grabbed her daughter's hand, pulled her close, and walked away faster, her heart racing. She tried to convince herself she was overreacting, that it was just another parent. But the instincts she had developed over 27 years of fending for herself were screaming that something was very wrong. Later that night, Dolly, her neighbor, knocked on the door. The usual kind smile on the 68-year-old woman's face was gone, replaced by a look of deep concern. "Someone was asking questions today," Dolly said in a low voice. "A man in a suit, with his hair all neat. He was polite, but it was a fake, kind of polite. He wanted to know where the little girl goes to school, what time you get her, and if anyone else ever picks her up." All the color drained from Lena's face. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him I had no idea," Dolly answered, her eyes looking sharp. "I am old enough to know you do not give answers to a stranger's questions." Lena shut the door and double-bolted it. She peeked into the bedroom where Phoebe was sleeping next to Biscuit, then took out her phone and called Jude. He was there in less than 15 minutes. But the man who walked into her Dorchester apartment was not the daddy Jude who sat on the floor and drank pretend tea from a tiny pink cup. This man was completely different. His face was a cold mask, his jaw was set, and his gray-blue eyes were hard, like steel forged in a fire. This was Jude Kensington, the man in charge. He was the man the entire East Coast knew you did not want to make an enemy of. He listened intently as Lena explained everything about the SUV and the man who questioned Dolly. Then he made one phone call to his associate, Brennan. "Check it out. A black SUV, tinted windows, near the Pano Solis preschool on Adams. I am sending the plate number. Find out who is asking questions about my daughter." His voice was not loud, but every word he spoke sent a chill down Lena's spine. It was not a fear of him, but a fear of the dangerous world he came from. A world that was now reaching its grimy hands toward her child. The information came just before midnight. Brennan called back, his voice tight with tension. The men belonged to Vincent Corsetti, a rival from New York who was trying to muscle Jude on a territory dispute. They had found out Jude had a daughter and a former lover. They saw a weakness, a way to gain leverage. A 4-year-old girl and a woman from Dorchester with no one to protect her were the perfect targets. Lena overheard Jude on the phone with Brennan, talking about things she did not understand. But she understood enough to know her daughter had become a pawn in a game between powerful criminals. A deep rage, hotter than any fear she had ever felt, began to build inside of her. "This," Lena said, her voice shaking with fury as Jude hung up the phone and looked at her. "This is why I was scared. This is what I warned you about at the lake. Your world is dangerous, and you have dragged us right into the middle of it." "Lena, Phoebe is 4 years old," she whispered, trying not to wake her daughter, but her voice was as sharp as a knife. 4 years old, Jude, and now someone is watching her. They are asking about her. They know her school and what time I pick her up. And it is all because of you, because your last name is Kensington, and because of this empire you have built. She took a step away from him, a move that created far more than just physical space between them. "My daughter will not be a pawn in your war, Jude Kensington. I have been on my own my whole life, and I can do it again. I will take Phoebe and leave Boston if I have to. I have been running forever. I know how to disappear." Jude did not say, "I will take care of it," or, "You can trust me." He did not offer any of the hollow reassurances Lena had heard from so many others. He just stared at her, his gray-blue eyes as cold and hard as stone. He gave her one single nod, then turned and walked out of the apartment. As the door clicked shut, Lena stood alone in her living room with her hand on her chest. She listened as his footsteps faded down the stairs, having no idea that in the next 12 hours, Jude Kensington was about to tear down everything he had spent the last 15 years building. The very first call he made after getting into his car was not to Brennan. It was directly to Vincent Corsetti. Brennan, who was driving, looked at Jude as if he had lost his mind. Jude's voice on the phone was so calm it was terrifying. "Vincent, it is Jude Kensington. That South Boston territory you have been wanting? It is yours. I am giving it all to you. But there is one condition. My family is completely off limits. From this second on, if I see even one of your men near my daughter or her mother again, this will not be a negotiation. It will be a war, and you know I do not make empty threats." Of course, Corsetti agreed. The South Boston deal was worth tens of millions of dollars, and he had just won it without a fight. But Jude was not finished. His second call was to Daniel Whitfield, a corporate lawyer. This was not the kind of attorney who helped hide crimes in legal documents. This was the kind who wore crisp white shirts and worked in downtown glass towers, handling legitimate business deals. "Daniel, I need to see you right now, tonight. I want to sign the paperwork to transfer all of my unofficial. I am handing over all operations of Kensington Holdings to the Executive Council. Every last bit. I am stepping away completely." The silence on the other end of the line was so long, Jude knew Daniel was struggling to believe what he had just heard. Then Daniel asked, "Are you certain? We are talking about the entire organization. All of it." Brennan drove him to the law firm. He was quiet the entire drive. But as Jude opened the car door to get out, Brennan finally said something. "Boss, that is 15 years of your life. The empire you built with your own 2 hands, all while living under the heavy weight of your father's expectations." Jude stopped, with one foot on the pavement, and looked back over his shoulder. "Everything that matters to me," he said, his voice quiet but solid as stone, "is sleeping in an apartment in Dorchester, holding a teddy bear named Biscuit." Brennan stared at him for a few seconds, then just gave a single nod. He did not say another word. 3 hours later, it was done. Jude had signed away everything. Every last document, every transfer, every single agreement. When he walked out of that law office at 2 in the morning, he was no longer the most feared man on the East Coast. He was just Jude Kensington, 36 years old, the owner of a clean real estate and casino business, and the father of a 4-year-old girl, a little girl whose first 4 years he had completely missed. But he did not drive straight to Lena's apartment. He went back to the mansion, walked into his private study, and opened a desk drawer. He took out a rolled-up tube of paper he had kept hidden there for weeks. He had put it there before the picnic, back when he did not even dare to let himself hope. They were architectural plans. The first thing he had designed himself since giving up his dream of being an architect 15 years ago. At 3 in the morning, Jude found himself standing outside apartment 312 in the Maple building in Dorchester. He had dark circles under his eyes. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was loose, and his hair was a mess from running his hands through it over and over. He held the transfer documents in one hand and the roll of blueprints in the other. He knocked gently. Lena opened the door. Her eyes were dark from a lack of sleep, and she was still in her clothes from the day. It was obvious she had either been waiting up for him or trying to figure out where she could run. She stared at him. He stared back at her. Then Jude placed the pile of documents on her kitchen table. "They are transfer papers," he said. "I signed them all. All the illegal business has been turned over to the council. I am completely out of it. From this moment on, Kensington Holdings is a legitimate company, just real estate, casinos, and investments. Completely clean." Lena glanced at the papers but did not pick them up. She looked back at him, her expression still guarded. But behind that guarded look, he could see something else fighting to get out. It looked a lot like hope. Jude unrolled the blueprints across her small kitchen table. Since the table was too narrow, he had to use a coffee mug and a salt shaker to hold down the corners. Under the flickering kitchen light, the design came into view. The lines were clean and precise, clearly the work of someone with real training, but they were drawn with passion. It was a 2-story brownstone in Brookline with a red brick front. Inside, on the first floor, there was a studio with huge north-facing windows, the kind of perfect light that graphic designers dream of. On the second floor, there was a child's art room with white walls perfect for hanging up drawings, and a small easel set right by the window. And in the backyard, he had drawn a young oak tree with a swing hanging from a branch. "My first project," Jude said, his voice softer than it had been all night. "I wanted to be an architect before my father decided I would be something else. This was the dream I gave up on. And now, I am starting it again." He pointed to the different spaces on the blueprint. "A studio for you. It has the north light you need for your design work. An art room for Phoebe. White walls so she can fill them with her art. And a backyard with a swing, because she asked me last week why our house did not have one." "Jude, you cannot buy my love with a house." He spoke quickly, worried she would get the wrong idea. "This is a promise. It is a promise that I am ready to build a new life from scratch. A clean life. No more shadows, no more crime. Just you, me, and Phoebe." Lena looked down at the drawing. Her fingers traced the outline of the studio, where he had even sketched in a desk and a wide window. Then her hand moved to the small art room where he had positioned Phoebe's easel right where the light would be best. Her hand was shaking. "Do you know what scares me the most?" she whispered. "It is not being poor. I have been poor my entire life, and I am still here. And it is not being alone. I have been alone forever, and I am still standing." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What truly terrifies me is the feeling of not belonging anywhere. All my life, I have bounced from one foster home to the next, from one rented room to another. I have never had a real home. No one has ever looked at me and said, 'You belong here,' and actually meant it." Jude moved toward her, slow and careful, the same way he had first approached Phoebe, giving her space to back away if she wanted to. She did not move. "You belong here," he said, his voice deep and sure, but with a slight tremor running through it. "Both of you. With me." Lena looked into his gray-blue eyes, which were shadowed by a night without sleep, at his wrinkled suit from spending hours in an office signing away an empire, and at the blueprints of a house built from a 15-year-old dream. Then, she took a step forward and laid her hand on his chest, right over the inner pocket where he had kept the coaster with her name on it for 5 years. She could feel his heart hammering against her palm. He was the crime boss, the architect, the father of her child. the man who had just dismantled an empire for a little 4-year-old girl, and the woman he had never been able to forget. Their first kiss in 5 years was so gentle it was barely there. It was just a whisper of breath, a soft brush of lips, hesitant and shaking, like they were testing to see if something so broken could ever be fixed. Then the kiss grew deeper, more confident, and 5 years of loneliness, 5 years of anger, and 5 years of a love buried under so many walls, all melted away in that tiny kitchen, under a flickering light, between the stack of legal papers and the plans for a dream house. When they finally broke apart, both of them had tears in their eyes. "So, that is a yes, right?" Jude whispered. Lena smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile without any defenses up. No armor, no walls. It was just her. "This is a let's build it together," she replied. The brownstone in Brookline was finished on a late autumn morning. The last leaves on the maple trees were changing from a fiery red to a deep coppery gold. The red brick front of the house glowed warmly in the soft sunlight. The large windows reflected the clear blue sky. In the backyard, the small oak tree was still holding onto a few yellow leaves. It was as if the tree wanted to welcome its new family with the last of its autumn beauty before winter set in. Phoebe was the first one to walk through the front door. She stood in the entrance hall, with Biscuit held tightly under her arm. Her eyes, which were a perfect copy of his, grew so wide they seemed to take up her whole face. Then she let out a squeal of pure, unfiltered joy, the kind that only a child can make. "My room!" she yelled. "Mama! Daddy! Where is my room?" Jude took her upstairs. When he opened the door to her art room, Phoebe stopped dead in her tracks. The walls were white. A small easel was placed by the window to catch the morning sun. A brand new box of crayons and a set of watercolors were sitting neatly on a shelf. And in the corner was a tiny wooden bed that Jude had built himself. It was the perfect size for a teddy bear. Phoebe looked at the little bed, then at Biscuit, and then she looked up at her father with eyes full of wonder. She gently placed Biscuit on his new bed, tucked the tiny blanket up to the bear's chin, and then turned to Jude. With the most serious face a 4-year-old could possibly make, she announced, "Biscuit has his very own room now." Jude knelt down to hug her tightly. Lena watched them from the doorway, holding onto the doorframe to steady herself. Her knees felt weak, not from sadness, but because for the first time in 27 years, her heart felt too full to handle. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. Catherine Kensington was standing on their front steps. She was dressed in an elegant light gray suit, her platinum hair perfectly in place, as always. But she was holding something that Lena did not expect to see. It was an antique silver picture frame. It was heavy and covered in detailed carvings, obviously a family heirloom and not something you could buy in a store. Inside was the photograph Catherine had arranged to have taken the week before at the mansion. It was Phoebe, sitting in a green velvet armchair with Biscuit on her lap, smiling so wide that her dimples showed. It was the first official portrait of a Kensington granddaughter. Catherine handed the frame to Lena. Then she put her hand on Lena's shoulder. She did not say a word. She did not have to. The gentle weight of her hand was firm enough to be comforting, but light enough not to overstep the fragile boundaries they had been building for weeks. It said more than any formal words of acceptance ever could. Catherine came inside and spent an hour in the art room with Phoebe. She showed her how to mix blue and white paint to create clouds, and told her that Jude used to love painting clouds when he was a boy. He always said that clouds were the only thing in the world that nobody could ever own. When it was time for Catherine to leave, she did not use the front door. Instead, she walked into the backyard. She paused under the young oak tree and turned to look back at the house. A light was on in the second-floor window, and Phoebe's silhouette was dancing behind the curtain. The sound of her laughter drifted out into the cool autumn air. Catherine stood there by herself for a long time. The warm light from the window softened the features of the family's stern matriarch, and for the first time in many, many years, she smiled. It was a private smile, meant for no one else to see, the kind of smile that comes from a deep and final sense of peace. Catherine knew she had finally done the right thing after so many years of simply standing by. With that, she turned and walked away, her steps feeling light on the stone path toward the back gate. She was removing herself from a picture that she knew was finally complete without her. That night, Jude carried Phoebe to bed after she had bathed and changed into the starry pajamas Catherine had bought for her. Phoebe lay down on her new mattress, grabbed her stuffed bear, Biscuit, from the nightstand to cuddle with, and looked up at her father. "Daddy, this is our real house, right?" "Yes, princess. This is our house forever." "Forever." A smile spread across her face, showing her dimple as those heavy silver blue eyelids slowly drifted shut. Within minutes, her breathing became soft and steady, the peaceful sleep of a child who finally had her own room, a daddy, a mama, and a home. Jude stood watching her for a long time before he went downstairs. He took the painting Phoebe had made at Walden Pond out of its protective tube. It showed three figures holding hands by a lake with the word family written above them, and he hung it on the living room wall in the most important spot. It was the first thing anyone would see when they walked into the house. Next to it, he hung a small glass frame. Inside was an old coaster from Rosie's Cafe. Its edges were worn down, the Rose logo had faded, and on the back, written in slanted blue ink now blurred by time, was the name Lena. The coaster was finally protected behind glass. After 5 years in his suit pocket, after thousands of nights on a bedside table in London, after tens of thousands of times his thumb had traced her name in the dark, it had finally found its last resting place. It was no longer an object of pain, no longer proof of loss, but the very first page of a brand new story. Lena stood by the window of her first-floor studio, a room Jude had specially designed for her. The large, north-facing window let the moonlight spill across the new wooden floor in a silver path. She stood there, her hand against the cool glass, looking out at the backyard where the swing moved gently in the evening breeze. Jude came up quietly behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. They stood together in the moonlight, listening to the wind and to the soft creaks of the new house settling, almost as if it were breathing. They also listened to the steady sound of Phoebe's sleep coming from the baby monitor Jude had installed on their first day there. "We lost 5 years," Lena whispered. Jude tightened his arms around her just a little. "We have a lifetime ahead of us," he answered. And the story ends right here, in this brownstone in Brooklyn, where the coaster with Lena's name sits in a frame beside a crayon drawing labeled family, where the stuffed bear Biscuit has his very own bed, and where a former mob boss burned down an entire empire just to build a house with a swing for his daughter, and where a 27-year-old orphan has finally found the one place she belongs. Sometimes, life takes a lot from us. It takes time. It takes chances. It takes the people we love. But sometimes, if we are brave enough to open our hearts again, strong enough to forgive, and patient enough to believe in actions instead of just words, miracles can happen. They might arrive late, but they are never too late. If this story has touched your heart, please press the like button to support our channel in telling more stories like this one. Share this video with the people you love, or with anyone who needs to hear that. No matter how difficult life gets, love and sincerity always find their way back home. And please do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the new, moving stories we share every single day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever lost someone and then found them again? Or are you, like Lena, somewhere on the journey of searching for where you belong? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one and want to hear what is in your heart. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.